In this video, I want to go over a few things in Chapter 16, beginning with Section 3 on the thyroid and parathyroid glands. And this picture, you can kind of see where the thyroid gland is located. It is in the neck, just below the larynx or the voice box. You see a gland tissue here called the thyroid gland. We're going to talk about three main hormones that the thyroid gland produces. The first two are shown on this slide, T3 and T4. You can see what T3 and T4 actually stand for, triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine, but usually you just see these abbreviated T3 and T4. And here's a few points about each one of these thyroid hormones. They're basically metabolic type hormones. And so the first point to make here is that they require a protein, transport binding protein, to help them be transported in the blood. And so that type of protein is called a thyroxine binding globulin. Globulin is just a name for a protein in the blood, and this particular hormone requires a protein to help it travel around in the bloodstream. Now, the second thing about T3 and T4 is that because they are metabolic type hormones, they help to break down glucose. As you remember from 168, glucose and lipids or fats. You break down these things, and that helps you to produce energy. Even a little protein metabolism, you can actually produce some energy from breaking down proteins as well. And so by increasing the rate of breaking down some of these biomolecules, you produce some energy. By producing this energy and by increasing metabolism, that leads normally to an increase in your body temperature, and that eventually helps in the growth of your tissues. Now, the other hormone that's produced by the thyroid gland, a lot of people forget about this hormone, but it's calcitonin. And you can kind of see in the name calcitonin up here that it has something to do with an element called calcium. And so there are particular cells that we'll look at a little later called parafollicular cells. These are cells that are actually producing the calcitonin. Calcitonin helps to lower your blood calcium levels. So you could look up what the normal level of calcium is in the bloodstream, whatever that range is. If it starts to get a little too high, then calcitonin is secreted, and that helps to lower the blood calcium levels by taking some of that calcium and transferring it over into the bone matrix. And so that's first bullet point up here. Secretion is triggered by high calcium concentration. All right, and so in other words, this is a humoral type of a mechanism like we talked about in the beginning part of the chapter. This is a humoral type because it's based on the presence of a particular molecule other than a hormone. So if you have a higher than normal level than calcium, then these parafollicular cells inside of the thyroid gland, they secrete the calcitonin. That goes into your bloodstream, and its target tissue is the bone cells, specifically osteoclasts and osteoblasts. And so hopefully you remember those from 168. Osteoclasts, they're the cells that are trying to break down the bone matrix. And so in this case, it's going to slow down their activity, but it essentially extends the activity of the osteoblasts. Remember that osteoblasts are the ones that are building or maintaining or really building up the bone matrix. And so by increasing those and decreasing the osteoclasts, that helps take some of the calcium from the blood and put it into the bone matrix. Now, the second gland we need to talk about, which is associated with the thyroid gland by its location, is the parathyroid gland. It's technically a separate gland, although it is located basically embedded. They are just really to the outside or the exterior of the thyroid gland. Now, this is a posterior view. So this is looking at, you see thyroid gland tissue on the posterior, and you have usually 4 nodules that make up these parathyroid glands. And so they secrete a hormone called parathyroid hormone, which essentially does the opposite of calcitonin. And so where calcitonin lowers your blood calcium levels, parathyroid are going to help to increase your blood calcium levels. And so these are basically regulating or going through homeostasis for calcium. That's what they're for. They're trying to balance your calcium levels. Now, it does this by targeting a couple of different tissues. Parathyroid hormone targets tissues of the bone, and kidneys and intestines. And so by stimulating the osteoclasts, helping to speed up the osteoclast, that helps to remove some of the calcium from the bone matrix and put it back into the bloodstream. Now, it also tries to help your body retain some of the calcium. And so one of the target tissues here is the kidneys. And so that you don't basically excrete out liquid waste, from the kidneys, by the kidneys, so you don't waste any of the calcium that you already have. One of the target tissues for parathyroid gland are the kidneys, and that helps you to reabsorb more calcium so you can get it back into the bloodstream. Similarly, it helps to with the production of vitamin D. You may remember talking a little bit about vitamin D in 168. Usually you cover that when we talk about the integumentary system. But vitamin D is a vitamin or molecule that basically helps to absorb calcium from the intestines. And so these last two bullets here suggest that, the parathyroid hormone helps your body to retain the proper level of calcium, so you're not just wasting it away through the waste products. All right, let's look at section 4. That covers the adrenal glands. Sometimes you'll see these referred to as suprarenal glands. It's the same, it's just two different words for the same gland, but the adrenal gland basically sits just on top of the kidney, on each of the kidneys. You have a gland tissue here. Now there's two main sections of this. The medulla section, this means the middle of the tissue, which in the microscope image here, the slide image, you can see here at the bottom, this is the medulla section, or the middle. And then you have the cortex, which is the outer layer of the tissue. The medulla section secretes two main hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And then the cortex layer is divided into 3 different zones. We'll look at this in lab. The 3 different zones are listed here. Each one of these zones produces a separate hormone. So let's start by talking about the medulla section and the 2 hormones that's produced there, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Both of these help to prepare the body for some kind of physical activity. And so you may have talked about like the fight or flight type scenario, and that's what these 2 hormones are there to do. Epinephrine, specifically, epinephrine increases your blood glucose levels. So it puts glucose back into the blood. And so that helps glucose, is basically an energy source. And so that helps your body get some of the energy that it needs. Notice point number 2, that it increases fat breakdown in adipose tissue, the storage tissue for fats. And so this helps to break down some fats. What do you get when you break down fats? You get more energy. And so both of these are pointing to getting the energy that your body's going to need for physical activity. Then point number 3, notice that it dilates, this hormone epinephrine helps to dilate or open up blood vessels that go to your skeletal muscles and to your heart muscle, your cardiac muscle. And so by having more blood flow to these areas, again, you're trying to help prepare the body for physical type activity. Now, these 2 hormones also work together, epinephrine and norepinephrine, to do a few other things. One is that they both help to increase your heart rate. They speed up the heart rate. And again, even if you're like exercising, your heart rate increases because you have epinephrine and norepinephrine at work there. Not only does your heart rate increase, the force of the heart of contraction, the force of contraction increases. And so many times these will cause your blood pressure maybe to go up temporarily. And so the other thing that you see is that not all blood vessels dilate in response to these hormones because they have different receptors in different locations. Some vessels actually constrict. And so some of the blood vessels associated with the skin and some of the other organs, including the kidneys and your gastrointestinal tract, your digestive system, some of those actually constrict. That's because you're trying to send the blood vessel, you're trying to send the blood to the most important organs at the moment. This, again, is kind of like a fight or flight type scenario. You're in some kind of crisis situation, and you're trying to send out the blood flow where it's needed most, and that's usually your skeletal muscles, your heart, your cardiac muscles, some of your vital organs like your brain and your lungs. And then notice that the effects of these hormones are very short-lived. In other words, these hormones will break down. They're metabolized very quickly. So once the crisis situation is over, once the fight or flight scenario is over, then your normal functioning of your vessels and your organs and things should go back to normal. Your heart rate should go back to normal and decrease. Your blood pressure should lower as well. The cortex of the adrenal gland, there's 3 zones, and each one produces different hormones. Now, these are steroid-based hormones, so they're basically lipid-type hormones that come from that cholesterol-type molecule. They're not cholesterol, but they come from a similar type of molecule of cholesterol, and so they have some similarities. They are lipid-based, and so the first group is called mineral corticoids. The example here is what I really want you to know, aldosterone. We'll talk about aldosterone not just here, but actually throughout some of the other chapters. We'll see aldosterone because it's very important in balancing your blood pressure. Now, it's produced by the zona glomerulosa. We'll talk more about that. That's the zone of the cortex that it's produced. That's the outermost zone. And it basically is secreted whenever your blood pressure starts to get lower. And it does this by trying to retain as much sodium levels as it can. All right, so you can think of sodium as salt, but it increases the rate of sodium reabsorption. So make the connection between aldosterone and sodium retention. It reabsorbs sodium, so it helps to increase sodium levels. When you increase sodium levels, water, because of osmosis, wants to go toward that sodium. And so whenever you increase sodium, water increases as well. Whenever you decrease sodium, water's going to decrease. Your fluids are going to decrease. And so the reason why aldosterone is important is because it helps to retain sodium, that helps you to retain water, that helps your body fluids to go up, and that helps your blood pressure to go up. So you need aldosterone secreted whenever your blood pressure is low. Number 2 is something called a glucocorticoid. This is in the middle zone of the adrenal gland called the zona fasciculata. And the main hormone here is cortisol. And so cortisol is the main hormone that helps in metabolism. It increases fat and protein metabolism. We talked about cortisol briefly in the other lecture, but cortisol helps in metabolism by increasing fat and protein metabolism. It helps in a process known as gluconeogenesis. That's production of glucose by the liver. And so again, it's trying to help get energy for the body, but it also helps to limit or to balance out the inflammatory response. So it actually decreases your inflammatory response and essentially decreases your immune system whenever cortisol is secreted. Then the third category are androgens. These are basically sex hormones, and this comes from the innermost zone, the zona reticularis of the cortex. And these are generally secreted and converted into the sex hormone testosterone. And this is present in both males and females. Although males get most of the testosterone they produce from the testes, a small amount is produced here in the adrenal glands for males and females. And basically this testosterone helps to stimulate secondary sex characteristics. And for females, it really plays a role in the sex drive. Section 5 is going to be looking at the pancreas and some of the hormones that it produces. First of all, the pancreas is located along the small intestine and the stomach. And you'll get to take a look at this eventually when we do the fetal pig dissection. We'll show you a picture of this in a little bit. But the fetal pig dissection will show you where the pancreas is located. And it's essentially both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. And so as an exocrine gland, it's going to produce some enzymes. I have it labeled up here, pancreatic digestive juices. These are basically enzymes that go into the small intestines through a duct. We'll talk more about the exocrine functions when we get to the digestive system. But here we're mainly concerned about the endocrine functions. And so there's 3 different cell types that we're going to find in the pancreas that help to produce different hormones. And so the first one is an alpha cell that produces something called glucagon. Beta cells, you've probably heard of insulin. So Beta cells produce insulin, and delta cells produce something called somatostatin. So let's look at these three and take a look at them. Glucagon and insulin together, they basically help to balance your blood glucose levels. So they're in charge of glucose regulation or glucose homeostasis. They're balancing blood glucose levels, and they're basically doing kind of opposite work of each other. Glucagon is helping to increase the summary here is that glucagon helps to increase blood glucose levels. The way it does it is it targets cells of the liver, the muscles, and adipose tissue, and it helps to break down some of the storage molecules that are inside of these cells. So inside of your liver and inside of your muscle tissue, you're storing up different reserves, chemical reserves, energy reserves, and adipose tissue, you're storing up lipids. And so glucagon is going to help free up some of that energy and free up some of that glucose. And so it promotes reactions that increase levels of glucose. Here's a couple of vocabulary words for you. We've seen a couple of maybe we've seen both of these already, but when you break down glycogen, that's called glycogenolysis. If you remember, glycogen is how the body stores glucose for long-term use. It stores glucose in the form of glycogen. That's what the liver helps to do, and it stores it in the liver cells and some of the muscle cells. So glycogenolysis is what glucagon can do to break down glycogen to help raise up the levels of glucose in the blood. You can also form new glucose, essentially, and that's the production of glucose in the liver. And we've talked about this word, gluconeogenesis. Insulin, remember, is basically doing the opposite of glucagon. It's trying to decrease blood glucose levels, and it's trying to do this by trying to get these the glucose and the nutrients from the blood into the cells of the body. And so it's helping to promote the uptake and the storage of some of these nutrients such as fats or lipids or amino acids or glucose especially. But all of these are considered to be nutrients. All of these need to be stored, and so that's what insulin is trying to do. It helps to form the glycogen in the liver. It helps to form the lipid, the fats and the carbohydrates that get stored in the adipose tissue. It even has a feeling of fullness. So once insulin gets kicked into the body, you have, this is just a vocabulary word, something called satiety. That's a feeling of fullness. It makes you feel like you're full after you've eaten so that you don't, overeat. All right, section 6, we'll briefly look at a few other endocrine glands as we kind of wrap up our discussion of endocrine glands and tissues, some of the hormones they produce. The pineal gland, you may have seen this in 168 in the nervous system. Sometimes you talk about some of the glands associated in the brain. And so this is actually in an area of the brain just beside of the thalamus and hypothalamus area. It's in a location called the epithalamus. And the main hormone here that you need to know is melatonin. Many of you may have heard of melatonin, maybe even had a melatonin supplement before. Melatonin helps in the process of sleep. It has some other functions, but it basically helps the body to know that it's time to go to sleep and helps in the sleep-wake cycle. They've also found that melatonin seems to decrease a reproductive hormone that's produced by the hypothalamus called GnRH, gonadotropin-releasing hormone. The thymus gland, another endocrine gland, we'll briefly talk about it here, and then we'll see it again when we get to lymphatic system. But this is located, remember, we've talked about the thyroid gland, and that was kind of right around the larynx and right around the trachea. If you go just inferior to that, just keep going down, you would run into the thymus gland. They don't show the heart here, but this is basically sitting kind of right on top of the heart. And so the thymus gland is important because it helps to develop the immune system, specifically T cells. And we'll talk more about T cells in another chapter, but these are some of your lymphocytes, white blood cells. And so thymosin is a hormone that helps in the development of those T cells. Reproductive system hormones, we'll mention a few of these here, and then we'll see these again at the end of the semester when we get to the reproductive system. We'll look more at these. We'll kind of look at a few of these here in the pathway that's involved. The pituitary gland produces two hormones. We've already mentioned these, LH and FSH. They go into the bloodstream, where in the males, their target tissue is the testes. The testes produces testosterone, and testosterone is the main male reproductive hormone that helps to develop male reproductive organs and also establish some secondary sex characteristics. Female reproductive system, the pathway is very similar. You have some different hormones here, but the pathway is similar. It begins with the pituitary gland. Actually, you could even talk about how the pathway begins with the hypothalamus, because remember, it's the hypothalamus that produces the GnRH, and the GnRH is what goes to the pituitary gland. And of course, in this case, we're talking about the anterior pituitary gland, and that causes LH and FSH to be produced and released. For females, that's going to the ovaries, and the ovaries will produce estrogen and progesterone. Both of these help to control the reproductive cycle. The ovarian cycle help to prepare for other conditions such as lactation, female reproductive organs, mainly the ovaries, and then also secondary sex characteristics. One other hormone, in this case, we'll talk about, we still have a few more left in the chapter that we'll mention. Leptin is a hormone you don't hear very much about. We'll talk briefly about this, but there are some cells called adipocytes. You probably talked about these in 168. Adipocytes are the cells that store lipids or store fats. They actually produce leptin, and leptin should also help to induce that feeling of fullness, which is called satiety, just like we mentioned before, and that helps to prevent overeating or overfeeding. Now, another hormone here is ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. We'll see a few things on it here, and then we'll talk more about this when we get to the cardiovascular system and the urinary system a little later on. But for now, we'll talk about a few main things here. It is produced by the heart. So this is a hormone that's produced by the heart. And it's produced in the section of the heart known as the right atrium. That's why it's called atrial up here in the name, because it's produced in an atrium of the heart, a chamber of the heart, whenever the blood volume increases. So generally this would be you would have higher blood volume, and you may even have higher blood pressure because of the higher blood volume. So this is a hormone that's going to try to get your blood volume back down. It's going to try to decrease your blood volume. So these things here, these other bullets are all about trying to decrease your blood volume and hopefully decrease blood pressure. So one of the things it can do, AMP can help to decrease sodium retention or reabsorption. You get rid of sodium, you get rid of some fluids. That decreases blood volume. That decreases blood pressure. It can block the ADH from the pituitary gland. It can help to increase how much you urinate, increases the volume of the urine produced, okay? And so whenever your blood returning back to the heart, this is the feedback mechanism here. This is the negative feedback part of it. Whenever the venous return is lowered, this is blood returning back to the heart. Whenever that goes down, the volume in that right atrium goes down, and that means your hormone production, ANP, also goes down. By the way, inside of the word here, natriuretic, the natri part is the root word for where we get the word sodium. If you remember from chemistry, the symbol for sodium is Na, not So. It's Na, and that stands for natrium. Natrium is the Latin word for sodium, and so here you see that it has something to do with sodium, and it's a uretic or like a diuretic. Diuretic means you get rid of fluids, and so this is telling you that ANP is a hormone located in the heart that helps to, it's a diuretic because it helps to get rid of some extra sodium, that helps you to get rid of fluids. Now, the last couple of things we'll look at is a few ideas of homeostasis. We've kind of seen this before, some of these before, and so this is going to be kind of review or summary. But fluid homeostasis or fluid balance, these are just a few things to kind of think about in two different scenarios. Let's say, for example, if you have low blood volume or low blood fluid, or your body fluids are low, that means you're dehydrated maybe. You need more fluids, that means you need more ADH. And you need more aldosterone. But it also means you need to decrease your atrial natriuretic peptide. Okay. The other thing to think about is that ADH and aldosterone basically kind of work together. They go the same direction usually, and then ANP is always going to go opposite of ADH and aldosterone. If the scenario is different, if the scenario is opposite, let's say you have high blood volume or high body fluids, maybe you have higher blood pressure and you need to lower the body fluids, or you're overhydrated, then that means you don't need to retain fluid, so you need to decrease the ADH, you need to decrease your sodium and your aldosterone, and you need to increase this hormone, ANP. For metabolic homeostasis, or balancing metabolism, balancing some of your nutrient levels, this is kind of what's going to happen. At rest, while you're fasting, in other words, you're not eating for a time. Let's say you're asleep for 8 hours. You're not eating while you're asleep. You're fasting, essentially. And so you still need to balance out your glucose levels even when you're not eating. They need to have some kind of balance. And so there's some hormones in place that help to balance your glucose levels whenever you're not eating. Glucagon helps to do that. That's one of the main ones. Growth hormone actually helps to do that. That helps to break down, go through some nutrient metabolism, fat metabolism, and that helps to increase blood glucose levels whenever they get low. Remember, we said that thyroid hormones can stimulate, the production of glucose. So does cortisol. You could add cortisol to this list. That helps to stimulate glucose production. And then while you're eating or while you have nutrients in the system, remember, insulin is the main hormone here that helps to regulate and balance your levels. So insulin, remember, is going to lower your blood glucose levels. And then I put together this little flow chart, little checklist. The question is, as blood nutrient levels go down, let's say you've had a meal, but it's been several hours since you've eaten, and so now your blood glucose levels are starting to go down. What happens to each one of these hormones to that, in response to a lower blood glucose level? So as blood glucose levels goes down, what should happen to insulin? Well, you would need your insulin to go down because you don't have as much glucose in the blood, so there's no need for the pancreas to produce insulin. So that's going to drop. Blood glucose goes down, your glucagon should now go up because now you need more glucose, in the bloodstream, and so glucagon is going to help to increase blood glucose. Growth hormone is going to do the same. It's going to increase. Cortisol should do the same. It should also increase. So you kind of use that as a little scenario to try to think about not just the definition for each one of these hormones, but kind of what reaction does it have? What cause and effect system does it have?